In the winter skies of Europe in 1944, the air offered no mercy. Flak burst like black iron blossoms, and fighter contrails stitched white scars across the cold blue. Somewhere above occupied territory, a German aircraft took a direct hit. Fire tore through its fuselage, crawling along the wings with mechanical inevitability. The engine screamed, then faltered. Inside the cockpit, training dissolved into instinct. Altitude bled away. The pilot knew the mathematics of descent. He also knew that once the ground arrived, the war would not loosen its grip, it would tighten it. For a German airman, survival beyond the crash was a fragile hope. Enemy territory meant interrogation, captivity, or execution by circumstance. Uniforms marked men more clearly than names. Even if he lived through the impact, injury would slow him, smoke would betray him, and the countryside itself had learned to watch the skies. The Luftwaffe would record him as missing, then lost. His war would end in silence, filed away in a ledger already crowded with vanished men. The irony waited below, not in the wreckage, but in the figure who would soon emerge from it, an American soldier trained to kill men like him. In this war, mercy was not part of doctrine. Risk was calculated in objectives, not conscience. And yet, amid the hedgerows and ruined villages, an individual choice still mattered. One man would see another not as an enemy uniform, but as a human being burning in the wreckage of a machine built for death. Wounded and disoriented, the pilot moved when he could, hid when he must. Pain narrowed the world to simple decisions, forward or still, noise or silence. Each step carried the threat of discovery. Patrols passed, voices echoed. The war pressed close, not as ideology, but as boots on frozen ground. Survival became a collaboration between chance and restraint, courage and fear, and the unexpected intervention of someone who should not have been there at all. What neither man yet understood was that this brief convergence, this moment of quiet defiance against the logic of total war, was only the beginning. Because in choosing to save a life, they were stepping into a moral terrain far more dangerous than any battlefield. And somewhere beyond the smoke and snow, the consequences of that choice were already unfolding. The German pilot had been trained for mastery of the air. Years of discipline had taught him to read clouds, calculate angles, and trust machines hurtling at hundreds of miles an hour. But on the ground, none of that knowledge applied. Stripped of altitude and speed, he was reduced to the oldest condition of war, vulnerability. His flight jacket no longer signaled authority. It marked him as prey. The shock arrived slowly, then all at once. Pain radiated from the crash, sharp and unnegotiable. His leg refused to answer commands. Smoke clung to his clothes, a scent that carried for miles. Around him stretched a landscape he did not know, mapped only in briefing rooms and intelligence reports. Every hedgerow could conceal a rifle. Every farmhouse might already be listening. In the air, danger had been visible. On the ground, it was everywhere and nowhere. There was an irony he could not yet name. Hours earlier, he had released weapons from the safety of the sky, watching destruction unfold at a distance. Now survival depended on hands that might belong to the very enemy he had been trained to destroy. The war had inverted itself. Power had shifted not through strategy but circumstance. He no longer acted upon the world. He waited for it to act upon him. Each movement carried consequence. He learned to measure progress in yards, not miles. Silence became discipline. Pain demanded negotiation. To be seen was to vanish, into a prison camp, into a grave, into the anonymous machinery of a war that rarely paused to record individual endings. Yet still he moved, driven less by ideology than by the simple refusal to die unnoticed. What changed his fate was not luck alone, but a decision made elsewhere. An American soldier, bound by uniform and oath, chose to see beyond orders. In that choice lay defiance, not of command, but of inevitability. The pilot's life now rested on another man's willingness to accept risk without recognition. History often turns on divisions and directives. But here, in the shadows of occupied Europe, it narrowed to a single question. Would one soldier accept the cost of saving an enemy? The answer, still unspoken, was already shaping everything that would follow. The decision did not arrive with ceremony. It came in an instant, sharpened by urgency and consequence. An American soldier operating deep in contested territory recognized the figure ahead not as a target, but as a man barely standing. Moments earlier, that man had belonged to the enemy force raining fire from the sky. Now he was injured, exposed, and helpless. To intervene was to invite suspicion from every direction. To walk away was to comply with the quiet logic of war. Nothing in military training prepared a soldier for this choice. Doctrine defined enemies and objectives, not obligations of conscience. Yet amid the confusion of battle, moral clarity sometimes arrived with uncomfortable force. Saving an enemy offered no tactical advantage. It risked court-martial, retaliation, or death. And still, the soldier moved forward, compelled by a belief older than uniforms that a life once seen clearly carried its own authority. The irony was unmistakable. Wars are fought to break the will of another nation, to impose outcome through violence and attrition. Here, the act that required the greatest courage was not destruction, but preservation. In choosing mercy, the soldier stepped outside the purpose of the conflict without abandoning his humanity. The battlefield did not change, but its meaning did. The struggle unfolded in measured steps. Enemy patrols passed within earshot. Fields offered no cover. Every pause risked discovery. The injured pilot slowed them both, forcing constant recalculation, when to move, when to hide, when to trust the dark. Weapons remained ready but unused. Survival depended less on firepower than restraint. In that restraint lay danger and also resolve. What sustained them was not strategy, but shared silence. Two men bound by nothing but circumstance moved through the ruins of Europe, each aware that a single error would end them both. The soldier carried not only the weight of another body, but the burden of a choice he could not explain to anyone else. History often records battles and borders. It rarely records moments like this, when humanity surfaced against instruction and mercy demanded more bravery than violence. Yet it is in such moments that the moral shape of a war becomes visible. And as they moved deeper into the night, neither man could know how far the consequences of that decision would reach. Military service is built on clarity. Orders define purpose, uniforms define allegiance, and loyalty narrows the world into allies and enemies. For the American soldier moving through occupied Europe, that structure had guided every decision until now. The rules were unambiguous. Protect your unit, complete the mission, neutralize the threat. And yet, standing beside a wounded German pilot, those rules began to feel insufficient. In choosing to preserve a life rather than end one, he placed humanity above instruction, quietly, without witnesses, and without assurance that history would ever notice. The danger of that decision was immediate and absolute. Discovery would offer no explanation, no appeal to conscience. To fellow soldiers, aiding the enemy could be mistaken for betrayal. To German patrols, it would mean summary execution. There were no neutral outcomes. Each step forward deepened his exposure, turning hedgerows into hazards and every sound into a possible end. Courage here was not loud. It was sustained, deliberate, and lonely. There was a deeper irony at work. Combat rewards precision, aggression, and control under fire. But this act demanded something rarer. The bravery to save an enemy required restraint when violence was easier and moral clarity when obedience would have been safer. It asked the soldier to accept risk without glory and to act without the protection of doctrine. In that sense, the war's values were inverted. The most dangerous act was no longer attack, but mercy. The struggle unfolded in constant recalculation. Routes were chosen not for speed, but for concealment. Movement paused when voices approached, resumed when silence returned. The injured pilot slowed them, forcing decisions that balanced urgency against caution. Each choice carried ethical weight. Abandonment would ensure survival. Persistence endangered them both. The soldier's resolve was tested not once, but repeatedly in moments so small they would never appear in official reports. What emerged from this ordeal was not a battlefield victory, but a revelation about heroism itself. The defining act of courage was not measured in enemies defeated or ground taken, but in the willingness to see an adversary as human and to accept the cost of that recognition. In a war designed to reduce men to targets, this choice restored individual meaning. Long after the gunfire faded, this moment would remain difficult to categorize. It did not change the course of campaigns or alter maps, but it reshaped the moral landscape for two men bound briefly by circumstance. And as they pressed onward under cover of darkness, one truth became unavoidable. This decision, made in silence, would follow them far beyond the battlefield, into consequences neither could yet imagine. The landscape offered no refuge. Forests thinned into fields, fields into roads, each transition increasing the risk of discovery. The American soldier moved first, scanning tree lines and listening for the irregular cadence of boots. Behind him, the wounded German pilot fall. Load as best he could, each step measured, each breath controlled. At any moment, the countryside could reveal them. Enemy patrols moved with purpose here. This was not wilderness. It was occupied ground. Survival became an exercise in judgment. The soldier relied on memory and instinct, terrain studied in briefings now confronted at ground level. A ditch offered concealment but slowed progress. A path promised speed but invited exposure. The pilot, despite injury, contributed when he could, pointing out landmarks he recognized from the air. Trust formed not through words but through action. Each decision, accepted without debate, tightened the fragile bond between them. The irony of their dependence was unmistakable. Only days earlier, they would have sought each other's destruction without hesitation. Now survival demanded cooperation. The war had forced an alliance neither doctrine nor ideology could explain. In this narrow corridor between discovery and escape, nationality lost its authority. What mattered was awareness, patience, and the willingness to protect one another from a threat that surrounded them both. The struggle stretched time. Hunger set in. Pain slowed movement further. When patrols approached, they pressed into the earth and waited, counting breaths until the danger passed. Silence became a shared language. The soldier adjusted his pace to the pilot's injury, knowing speed could kill them as surely as delay. Resourcefulness replaced firepower. Shadows replaced cover. Every mile exacted its cost. Gradually, something unexpected took hold. Familiar gestures, an offered canteen, a steadying hand, began to replace suspicion. Trust did not erase the war between them, but it allowed them to move through it. Collaboration emerged not as sentiment, but as necessity. In that necessity, a fragile humanity resurfaced, challenging the assumption that enmity was permanent. This journey would not appear on maps or after-action reports. No medals would mark its completion. Yet it revealed a quieter truth about conflict, that even in war, cooperation can outpace hatred when survival is shared. As they moved closer to uncertain safety, both men understood that the ground beneath them was not the only territory being crossed. And somewhere ahead lay the question of what would happen when this brief alliance was no longer required, when the war would demand its divisions once more. Time narrowed to seconds. Each pause, each footfall carried consequence. The American soldier understood this with growing clarity. Hesitation could expose them, speed could betray them, and a single misjudgment would end 2 lives at once. War had trained him to act decisively under fire, but this was a different calculus. There were no orders to follow, no unit to support him. Responsibility rested entirely on his judgment, and it pressed heavily. The shock was not fear of death, that was familiar, but the certainty of shared fate. If they were discovered, there would be no separation of guilt or consequence. The German pilot would not be spared, neither would the man aiding him. In that knowledge, the soldier moved with deliberate care, aware that every choice bound their lives closer together. Survival ceased to be individual, it became mutual. The irony was impossible to ignore. Military training had conditioned him to eliminate threats, to act swiftly and without doubt against the enemy. Now those same instincts were redirected. He shielded rather than targeted. He slowed rather than advanced. In preserving the life of a man once defined as an adversary, he challenged the rigid simplicity of wartime identity. The enemy was no longer abstract. He had a face, a limp, and a reliance that could not be dismissed. The struggle deepened as fatigue set in. Muscles tightened. Pain traveled upward from the pilot's injury, demanding stops they could not afford. Moral weight compounded physical strain. The soldier bore not only his own exhaustion, but the burden of a choice that grew heavier with each mile. Yet retreat was impossible. To abandon the pilot now would be to accept responsibility for his death. Endurance became an act of resolve rather than strength. In these moments, courage took an unfamiliar form. It did not announce itself in charges or gunfire. It appeared in restraint, patience, and the willingness to accept risk without validation. Defying the conventions of war did not weaken the soldier's resolve, it refined it. By choosing humanity over instruction, he affirmed a value that conflict is designed to suppress. What this revealed was not an exception, but a truth war often conceals. Rules govern battles, but conscience governs men. And sometimes the most dangerous act is not disobedience, but recognition, the acknowledgement that an enemy's life carries the same weight as one's own. As the night pressed on and the terrain shifted again, the responsibility did not lessen. It sharpened. Ahead lay decisions even more peary, lose than those already made. And with each step forward, the question remained unresolved. How long could this fragile defiance survive before the war demanded its due? The deeper they moved into hostile territory, the land itself seemed to resist them. Roads were avoided, fields crossed only at their edges. Patrols appeared without warning, helmets cresting ridgelines, voices carrying through the trees. Once they froze as a column passed so close that breath had to be counted, not taken. Another time, the soldier spotted disturbed earth just in time, the subtle sign of a minefield laid days earlier. War here was not only fought by men. It lingered in soil, wire, and silence. Progress demanded constant recalculation. The American soldier led, but the German pilot's experience mattered more than either had expected. From the air, he had memorized patterns, rail lines, crossroads, river bends, and now those memories became guidance on the ground. When to skirt a village, when to avoid a bridge, when terrain that looked safe was anything but. The battlefield that once separated them now required cooperation, blending two forms of knowledge forged on opposite sides of the same war. Pressure mounted with each encounter narrowly avoided. Fatigue dulled reaction time. Hunger sharpened irritability, then forced discipline. The soldier felt the strain of constant vigilance, the awareness that one mistake would be final. Stealth was no longer a tactic. It was survival itself. They moved when shadows were longest, rested where sound was swallowed, and trusted instinct when reason had been exhausted. There was an irony in how naturally their cooperation formed. In combat, coordination is drilled, rehearsed, enforced. Here it emerged without command. A glance signaled danger. A raised hand halted movement. Mutual reliance replaced suspicion, not because the war had softened them, but because circumstance demanded precision. Each man understood that survival depended not on dominance, but on alignment. Natural hazards proved as unforgiving as armed ones. Rain turned paths to mud, slowing the wounded pilot further. Cold settled into bones already strained by injury. Streams had to be crossed quietly, boots soaked, footing uncertain. Each obstacle consumed time they did not have, yet stopping was not an option. The war did not pause for exhaustion. As the journey stretched on, doubt crept in. Not doubt of intention, but of outcome. How far could they go before the odds finally closed? The soldier questioned whether he was leading them towards safety or deeper danger. The pilot wondered if trust could outlast desperation. These doubts were never spoken. Speech risked noise, and perhaps acknowledgement made failure more real. What held them together was not hope of reward, but recognition of shared vulnerability. In the margins of war, stripped of advantage and identity, they encountered each other as men rather than symbols. Their bond did not erase the conflict that brought them there. It existed alongside it, fragile and temporary, but real. This bond, forged under pressure, transcended uniform and language. It was built from necessity, sustained by discipline, and tested by fear. It did not pretend the war was anything other than brutal. It simply insisted that even here, cooperation could exist. As night gave way to a cautious dawn, they paused at the edge of another stretch of open ground. Beyond it lay uncertainty, perhaps safety, perhaps exposure. The dangers ahead were no longer abstract. They were immediate, waiting. And as they prepared to move again, one truth became clear. Whatever happened next would decide not just their survival, but the meaning of everything they had risked to reach this point. As they drew closer to Allied lines, the danger did not recede, it sharpened. Front lines were not clean borders, but unstable seams, crowded with patrols, artillery positions, and men trained to fire first and ask later. A misstep here would not mean capture. It would mean sudden death, delivered by those the American soldier called his own. The shock of that reality settled heavily. Survival now required navigating not only enemy territory, but the violent ambiguity of approach. Escape no longer seemed likely. It seemed improbable to the point of folly. Exhaustion had stripped away optimism, leaving only determination. The wounded pilot's strength faltered, his movements slower, his breathing shallower. The American adjusted again, redistributing weight, altering pace, refusing to let doubt dictate decisions. Trust between them was no longer tentative. It was absolute. Without it, they would not take another step. There was a deep irony in how survival now depended on the very lessons designed for killing. Stealth, once used to ambush, was repurposed to avoid contact. Timing learned for attack now dictated when to cross open ground unseen. Observation once meant identifying targets. Now it meant identifying mercy. Combat no. Edge, refined through violence, was being turned toward preservation. The tools of war were being quietly subverted. The struggle intensified as their bodies began to fail. Muscles cramped, vision blurred. Fear returned in waves, not the sharp fear of combat, but the dull fear of collapse. Each step became negotiation. Stop too long and patrols would close in. Move too quickly and the pilot would fall. The American soldier felt the edge approaching, the moment when endurance gives way to inevitability. Yet still, he moved. The landscape offered one last trial. A stretch of exposed ground lay between them and the uncertain promise of safety. No cover, no alternate route. Observation posts could be nearby. Artillery thundered in the distance, indifferent to individual lives. The soldier paused, calculating angles, listening for sound patterns he had learned long ago. The pilot waited without question. By now, silence was agreement. When they crossed, it was without haste and without hesitation. Timing mattered more than speed. Shadows were used sparingly. Every sense was engaged. The soldier felt the war watching him, not as ideology but as momentum. To stop moving now would be to surrender to it. What carried them through was not strength alone, but ingenuity and restraint. A diversion avoided, a pause extended, a choice not to fire. Compassion, often dismissed as weakness in war, proved decisive. It kept weapons lowered and hands steady. It prevented a fatal mistake born of panic. At the edge of Allied territory, recognition became its own danger. Accents, uniforms, and expectations collided. The American soldier understood the risk instantly. To explain would take time they did not have. To be misunderstood would be fatal. Once again, he chose decisively, not with force, but with clarity. The pilot stayed behind him, visible but silent, trusting the judgment that had carried them this far. In that final moment, courage revealed its fullest shape. Not the courage to advance under fire, but the courage to insist on humanity when fear demanded violence. Not the courage to destroy, but to protect, despite exhaustion, despite doubt, despite the crushing weight of consequence. As they stepped out of the shadows and into the uncertain recognition of Allied lines, the journey that had bound them together reached its breaking point. What awaited them now was no longer pursuit or patrol, but judgment. And with it, the final test of whether this improbable act of mercy would be allowed to endure beyond the battlefield. At this final threshold, the imbalance between the two men became absolute. The wounded pilot could no longer shape his own fate. Every step, every pause, every decision rested in the hands of the American soldier beside him. Pain had narrowed the pilot's world to endurance alone. He followed not out of confidence, but necessity. Survival was no longer something he could attempt. It was something granted, moment, by another man's resolve. For the American, the danger shifted form. Enemy patrols were behind them now, but a more immediate threat lay ahead. Allied lines were guarded by men trained to react without hesitation. An American soldier arriving with a German pilot at his side did not fit any manual. There would be no time for explanations under raised rifles. In this space between recognition and misunderstanding, the risk was stark. He could be mistaken for a traitor, an infiltrator, or worse. The uniform that once guaranteed safety now carried uncertainty. The irony was complete. Battlefields are designed to simplify morality, us and them, advance or retreat, victory or loss. Yet here on the edge of supposed safety, everything grew more complex. The American was no longer advancing against an enemy, nor defending against attack. He was asking his own side to pause, to see what war had trained them not to see. The battlefield, so often a place of clarity through violence, became a proving ground for restraint. The pilot sensed this shift even without understanding the language that would soon decide his fate. He recognized the tension in the soldier's posture, the careful way he positioned himself, visible but controlled. Trust now ran in only one direction. The pilot could offer nothing in return but compliance. His life depended on how convincingly another man could argue for it without words. This moment revealed how fragile the boundary between life and death truly was. It was not marked by trenches or wire, but by perception. A shouted command, a misread gesture, a second too long reaching for a weapon. History often attributes survival to strategy or strength, but here it rested on recognition, on whether one soldier could persuade others in an instant that mercy had a place even now. What unfolded next would never be recorded in official reports. There would be no citation for bravery, no commendation for moral risk. The war had no category for what was happening here. Yet this was heroism of a different order. Not the heroism of defeating an enemy, but of refusing to let the machinery of war claim another life when it did not have to. The irony lingered. The German pilot had survived anti-aircraft fire, crash, injury, and pursuit, only to face his greatest danger at the hands of those who represented salvation. And the American, having navigated enemy territory with discipline and courage, now faced judgment from his own side. Victory and survival, so often aligned in war, briefly diverged. This moment forced a reconsideration of what it meant to serve. The soldier was not abandoning his duty. He was redefining it, choosing to defend a principle rather than a position. In doing so, he exposed the truth that war tries to obscure. That moral clarity is not found in obedience alone, but in responsibility. As voices called out ahead and figures emerged from the haze of smoke and dawn, the outcome remained uncertain. Weapons could be lowered or raised. Orders could be questioned or enforced. In that suspended instant, balance between acceptance and annihilation, the story reached its narrowest point. Because here, on this invisible line, the war would decide whether compassion was an act to be punished, or one that could be allowed to live. They emerged into Allied lines not as victors, but as survivors. Exhaustion had stripped them of ceremony. The American soldier's uniform was caked with mud, his movements slowed by days of tension and restraint. The German pilot barely stood at all, held upright by will and the steady presence beside him. Rifles rose, voices cut through the haze. In that instant, everything balanced on recognition. Fear was sharp, immediate, and indiscriminate. Survival had narrowed to a final test. The shock was not the weapons pointed at them, but the sudden stillness after motion. For days, danger had demanded constant calculation. Now there was nowhere left to move. The soldier raised his hands slowly, deliberate, rehearsed not by training but by instinct. He spoke with clarity, not volume. He positioned himself between the rifles and the wounded man, a quiet continuation of the choice he had already made many times before. Against the weight of probability, the mission had succeeded. No plan had predicted this outcome. No doctrine supported it. Yet here they stood, proof that determination, judgment, and moral resolve could carry men through spaces where strategy alone could not. The rescue had not been efficient. It had been costly, slow, and uncertain. But it had worked. Against all expectation, both men were still alive. The irony of that fact lingered heavily. The German pilot, once a target tracked through gun sights, now owed his life to an enemy soldier who had risked everything to preserve it. War had assigned them opposite purposes, but circumstance had rewritten those roles. Destruction had given way to protection. In saving the life he had been trained to end, the American soldier had subverted the most basic assumption of combat. The turning point passed without ceremony. Questions were asked. Accounts were given. The pilot was taken away, no longer a threat, no longer a helpless burden, but a prisoner whose survival had been secured through extraordinary means. The American soldier was not celebrated. He was observed, assessed, quietly understood. Among his comrades there was no applause, only recognition, the kind that comes not from spectacle, but from knowing what it costs to do what he had done. In the days that followed, the war moved on. Operations continued. Orders were issued. This episode did not alter the front lines or the outcome of the conflict, but it altered something smaller and more enduring. For the pilot, survival meant more than escape. It meant living with the knowledge that mercy had come from an unexpected place, at a moment when ideology offered none. For the soldier, the choice could not be undone or compartmentalized. It became part of him, carried forward into whatever battles remained. What this moment revealed was not a contradiction of war, but a truth within it. Even in systems built for destruction, individuals retain the power to decide how far that destruction will go. Heroism in this sense was not loud. It was precise. It did not seek recognition. It accepted consequence. The rescue transformed both men, though in different ways. One returned to captivity with life intact. The other returned to duty with a deeper understanding of what service could mean. Neither would speak often of what had happened. The war offered little space for reflection, yet the memory endured, resistant to erosion. History often measures courage in battles won and enemies defeated, but this story resists that accounting. Its power lies in restraint, in the refusal to allow circumstance to erase humanity entirely. It reminds us that even at the height of global conflict, the war was still fought one decision at a time. Long after the Uns fell silent, this act would remain, unwritten in official histories but preserved in the lives it shaped. A quiet testament to moral courage, forged not in triumph but in compassion. And in a war defined by destruction, that choice proved to be its own kind of victory. After the rescue, the war did not pause, but something between the two men did. Removed from immediate danger, they were left with the weight of what they had shared. The German pilot was transferred into captivity, his injuries treated, his future uncertain. The American soldier returned to his unit, back into routine and orders, yet neither resumed the war unchanged. What bound them now was not circumstance alone, but memory formed under pressure, sealed by survival. Their bond had not been built through conversation or agreement. It had emerged through shared risk, through decisions made when speech was impossible and trust was compulsory. In those days behind the lines, each man had learned the limits of the other. Pain endured without complaint, risk accepted without reassurance. These observations mattered more than ideology. They formed a language deeper than allegiance. The irony of their connection was unmistakable. In any other context, they would have met as adversaries, one in the air, one on the ground, their encounter ending in fire or evasion. War demanded such endings. Yet here, survival had reversed the equation. The enemy became a responsibility. The rescuer became a lifeline. Their relationship defied the conventional narratives of combat, which prefer clarity over contradiction. What marked this as a turning point was not sentiment, but recognition. Both men understood that what had occurred was rare and perhaps unrepeatable. It did not negate the war. It did not erase the suffering beyond them. But it illuminated something easily forgotten amid violence. The capacity for empathy persists, even when systems are designed to suppress it. This realization carried its own weight. For the pilot, captivity was endured with a different awareness. He had seen the war's machinery from above and below, and had survived because someone chose restraint over certainty. That knowledge complicated his understanding of the enemy. For the American soldier, returning to duty meant carrying a memory that resisted simplification. He had not acted against the war's outcome, but alongside a deeper principle, one that existed before the war and would outlast it. They did not exchange promises. There were no declarations, yet the bond remained, sustained by the knowledge that in a moment when hatred would have been justified, compassion had prevailed. This was not a friendship in the ordinary sense. It was a connection defined by limits, brief, intense, and bounded by circumstance, but its impact was durable. The war continued to produce casualties, victories, and losses measured in numbers. This story did not fit easily into those accounts. It did not alter strategy or morale. It altered perspective. It revealed that even amid organized violence, individuals retain the power to choose how completely they surrender their humanity. Such moments rarely survive the noise of history. They are overshadowed by battles, by leaders, by outcomes too large to ignore. Yet they endure quietly, carried by those who lived them. Acts of humanity do not announce themselves. They persist in memory, shaping how survivors understand the world that demanded so much of them. In time, the war would end. Borders would shift. Uniforms would be folded away. But the connection formed here would remain untouched by those changes. It existed outside victory and defeat. It testified to the possibility that compassion, once exercised, cannot be undone. This revelation stands as the enduring lesson of their shared ordeal. That relationships forged in humanity can outweigh divisions imposed by ideology. That empathy does not weaken resolve, it clarifies it. And that even in war, perhaps especially in war, the most consequential bonds are formed not through conquest, but through mercy. As history moved forward, this connection would remain largely unseen, overshadowed by louder narratives. But it did not disappear. It waited quietly as proof that beneath the machinery of conflict, the human capacity for understanding had not been extinguished. In time, the immediacy of the rescue gave way to reflection. What had once been a sequence of urgent decisions, made under fire in darkness and under threat, began to settle into memory. The shock of it remained, not because of its danger alone, but because it had happened at all. In a war defined by efficiency and destruction, one act stood apart, resisting easy explanation. A life had been spared where the machinery of conflict expected none. Stories like this rarely survive intact. War compresses experience, favoring outcomes over intentions. Yet this one endured, passed quietly between those who had witnessed its edges, not as lead, but as testimony. It reminded listeners that bravery did not always arrive with orders or recognition. Sometimes it appeared as refusal, the refusal to let circumstance erase conscience. The irony was inescapable. The battlefield exists to break things, bodies, cities, certainty. It is engineered for destruction, and yet from that same ground emerged an act of profound humanity. The rescue did not negate the violence surrounding it, nor did it redeem the war that made it necessary. But it revealed a paradox at the heart of conflict, that even in places designed to extinguish compassion, it can still surface intact and demanding. As the war continued, this story began to circulate in fragments. Among soldiers, it became a quiet point of reflection. Not a directive, not a model to be replicated, but a reminder. Courage, they were reminded, was not limited to advancing under fire. It could also mean standing still when violence was expected. It could mean choosing responsibility over safety, restraint over certainty. This marked a turning point in how heroism was understood by those who heard it. The rescue demonstrated that courage did not always align with victory. It did not require an enemy defeated or ground taken. Sometimes it required accepting risk without reward. Saving a life offered no tactical advantage. It offered something rarer, a reaffirmation of purpose when purpose had been reduced to survival alone. For the German pilot, survival became inseparable from that moment. His life continued not because the war relented, but because one man refused to let its logic decide everything. That knowledge shaped how he remembered the conflict, not as a series of abstractions, but as an encounter with an unexpected mercy. For the American soldier, the risk he accepted could never be fully explained or justified within formal terms. It simply became part of who he was. The revelation here was not that war can produce heroes. That much is expected. It was that moral heroism often operates in quiet defiance of war's structure. The soldier's decision ensured survival, but it also left behind a legacy that extended beyond the two men involved. It challenged assumptions about loyalty, duty, and the limits of obedience. It suggested that responsibility does not end where orders begin. This legacy did not reshape history's broad arc. The war was decided by armies, industries, and nations. But history is not composed solely of its outcomes. It is also shaped by the choices that resist reduction, choices that reveal what was possible, even when it was unlikely. This rescue became one such marker, a small but enduring point of moral clarity. Long after the conflict ended, this story retained its quiet power, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered truth. That even amid the most organized violence humanity has created, individuals remain capable of choosing otherwise. That courage can exist without spectacle. That compassion, once exercised, leaves a trace that time does not easily erase. In the end, the lasting impact of this act was not found in recognition or record. It was found in the understanding it left behind, that the true measure of bravery is not always how fiercely one fights, but how firmly one protects what war tries hardest to destroy. And in that understanding, the rescue achieved something no battle ever could. Courage, when stripped of ceremony, always carries a price. In this case, it was paid in risk accepted without guarantee. The American soldier had wagered everything, his life, his reputation, his standing among his own, on a single decision made far from witnesses. The outcome could easily have been fatal. A patrol encountered too soon. A misunderstood gesture at the lines. A moment of doubt where none could be afforded. That none of these ended in catastrophe did not diminish the cost. It only clarified what had been at stake. The consequence of that choice was survival, but survival alone does not explain its value. The act proved invaluable precisely because it resisted the logic of war. Saving an enemy soldier offered no strategic benefit. It delayed movement, increased exposure, and created danger at every stage. Yet it preserved something war continually erodes, the idea that individual responsibility does not vanish under uniform. That idea carried forward quietly into the lives it touched. Here lies the central irony. Warfare celebrates bravery measured in advance and attack, in objectives seized and enemies overcome. But this courage did not advance a line or secure ground. It held ground instead, moral ground. It required the soldier to act against expectation, to accept vulnerability rather than dominance. In doing so, he demonstrated that bravery is not confined to violence. Sometimes it is found in restraint, in choosing the harder path precisely because it is harder to justify. The German pilot became the living consequence of that choice, not a symbol, not a status, but a man whose continued existence testified to an ethical decision made under pressure. He did not become an ally in the war's outcome. He became something else, a reminder that enmity is not destiny, and that survival can carry meaning beyond victory. In this way, courage redefined their relationship, transforming enemies into participants in a shared moral history. This revelation challenges the way heroism is often understood. It suggests that courage is not only reactive, not only something demanded by circumstance, but something chosen. The soldier was not forced to intervene. He was not compelled by orders or necessity. He acted because he judged that preserving a life mattered more than preserving certainty. That judgment carried consequences long after the immediate danger passed. There were no assurances that his actions would be forgiven or even understood. Silence followed instead. The war offered little space for reflection or acknowledgement. Yet courage does not require validation to endure. Its impact is often measured indirectly, in changed perspectives, in stories carried forward, in the quiet recalibration of what individuals believe is possible under extreme conditions. For those who learned of the rescue, it reframed assumptions. It suggested that the boundaries imposed by war are not absolute, that within even the most rigid systems there remains space for choice. Not every soldier would make such a decision. That is precisely why it matters. Courage is not common by definition. It is exceptional because of its cost. The price of this courage was ongoing. It meant living with the knowledge of what could have been lost and with the responsibility of having chosen differently. It meant accepting that such choices may never be fully reconciled with doctrine or rewarded by history. But it also meant knowing that, in a moment when humanity was most at risk of being erased, it had been upheld. In the end, this act did not alter the war's final outcome. It altered something smaller and more enduring. It demonstrated that ethical heroism is not an abstract ideal, but a lived practice, fragile, risky, and deeply personal. That enemies can become witnesses to one another's humanity, and that courage, when exercised with compassion, leaves behind more than survival. It leaves behind a standard, not one written into manuals or commemorated on monuments, but one carried forward in memory. A reminder that even in war, perhaps especially in war, the greatest bravery is sometimes found not in taking a life, but in choosing, at great cost, to let one continue. When the war moved on, as wars always do, the American rescuer returned to anonymity. His name did not appear in communiques. His action was not assigned a code name or folded into an operation. It lived instead in memory, in moments of quiet reflection when the noise of battle receded and left space for thought. He understood, perhaps better than most, that what he had done would likely remain invisible to history. Yet its importance was never in doubt to the one life it had preserved. In rare moments of stillness, the decision returned to him, not as triumph but as weight. He did not think of it as heroism. He remembered it as a moment when circumstance demanded an answer, and he had given one he could live with. The war had offered countless opportunities to destroy. This had been one of the few that asked him to protect. That distinction mattered, even if no record acknowledged it. The irony was stark. World War II was a conflict defined by industrialized destruction, bombers, divisions, factories calibrated for death at scale. Against that machinery, the act of saving an enemy soldier seemed almost subversive, yet it was precisely because of the war's brutality that this choice carried meaning. In an environment where violence was normalized, restraint became extraordinary. Mercy, exercised deliberately, became the ultimate act of defiance. History often reserves its praise for those who shape outcomes, generals, offensives, decisive moments etched into maps. But wars are also shaped by smaller decisions that never reach archives. This rescue did not change a campaign. It changed a life. And in doing so, it revealed a truth often lost in the abstraction of conflict, that humanity persists not because it is protected by systems, but because individuals choose to uphold it when systems fail to do so. For the German pilot, the rescuer's face did not fade into abstraction. It remained specific, human, inseparable from survival itself. The war would end, captivity would give way to return, but that moment would remain fixed, not as a debt to be repaid, but as evidence that the enemy was not a single, immutable thing. That realization, born in extremity, endured far longer than the uniform either man wore. For the rescuer, the knowledge was quieter but no less enduring. He had learned that courage did not always announce itself under fire. Sometimes ease it appeared in hesitation, in the pause before an action taken against expectation. He carried that understanding forward into a life shaped by a war that demanded much and explained little. If the choice ever troubled him, it was not because he doubted it, but because he understood how narrowly it had survived circumstance. The revelation at the heart of this story is simple and difficult. Weapons end conflicts. Humanity endures them. The most lasting force in war is not firepower or strategy, but the capacity of individuals to recognize one another beyond roles assigned by violence. This recognition does not stop wars, but it shapes what survives them. The rescuer never sought acknowledgement, and history did not offer it. Yet his action stands as a reminder that the measure of heroism is not always found where attention is directed. It is often found where it is least expected, in quiet decisions made without audience that preserve life in a world organized to extinguish it. In the end, this story does not belong to monuments or medals. It belongs to a moment when one man chose humanity over instruction, and in doing so altered another man's fate entirely. In a century defined by conflict, that choice remains small in scale, but vast in meaning. They counted victories in miles gained and enemies defeated. But history endures because, Once in a while, someone chose not to destroy what the war had already decided was expendable. He had been an enemy in the sky, distant, abstract, reduced to a silhouette against cloud and sun. From that height, war simplified itself. Targets moved, triggers were pulled, outcomes were observed at a remove. But on the ground, the abstraction collapsed. The enemy became a stranger, injured and exposed, no longer defined by altitude or allegiance. And in that moment, one man chose to risk everything to ensure he lived. That choice carried no illusions. It did not pretend that the war was misunderstood or that the violence surrounding them was accidental. Both men knew exactly what conflict they were part of and what it demanded. Yet the rescue proved something quieter and more enduring, that compassion could exist without denying reality. It did not require agreement. It required recognition. In war, ideology is designed to harden perception. It simplifies moral landscapes so that action can proceed without hesitation. Enemies are categorized, distance is maintained. But this rescue fractured that framework. Compassion did not dissolve the conflict. It defied it briefly but decisively. It demonstrated that even in the most rigid systems, individual conscience retains the power to interrupt inevitability. The respect that followed was not ceremonial. It did not rely on words exchanged or promises made. It existed in memory, shaped by the understanding that survival had been made possible by deliberate restraint. For the German pilot, that respect endured long after captivity ended and uniforms were set aside. His life moved forward with the knowledge that at its most fragile moment, it had been protected by someone trained to do the opposite. For the American rescuer, respect took a different form. It was not directed outward but inward, a quiet confirmation that the choice he made aligned with something deeper than orders or expectation. He did not measure its value by recognition, because none was sought. He measured it by its permanence. The fact that the moment did not fade mattered more than whether it was remembered by others. What this rescue ultimately revealed was not sentiment, but possibility. That even amid organized destruction, individuals remain capable of choosing differently. That compassion does not require permission, only resolve. And that such choices, once made, resist erasure. They outlast uniforms, borders, and the language of enemies. This story does not argue that war can be softened by goodwill alone. It does not claim that compassion can replace strategy or end violence. It makes a narrower, more precise claim, that within war's most unforgiving conditions, humanity can still assert itself, and when it does, it leaves a mark disproportionate to its scale. The respect forged here did not require reconciliation ceremonies or post-war declarations. It required only memory, a shared understanding that at a critical point, one life had been valued over certainty, and one decision had altered another man's fate entirely. That understanding endured quietly, immune to the passing of time. History will always record wars through battles and outcomes. It must. But beneath those records run quieter currents, moments when the logic of destruction was interrupted by conscience. These moments do not change maps. They change meanings. They remind us that while war determines who wins, individuals still decide who they are. In the end, this was not a story about enemies becoming friends. It was a story about enemies becoming witnesses to one another's humanity and to the truth that even in war, moral choice remains possible. He was an enemy in the sky, a stranger on the ground, and yet one man risked everything to ensure he lived. In saving a life, he created a legacy that no battle could erase.